Hi everyone. My name is Lauren Whitfield. Well, Lauren Whitfield Brooks now. I'm 34 years old. I live in Austin, Texas with my husband Marcus, our two kids, Elijah, who just turned 8, and Maya, who's 5, and a golden doodle named Biscuit, who has zero respect for personal space. And I never ever thought I'd be sharing this story publicly. For a long time, I convinced myself that keeping quiet was the dignified choice. The people who air their family drama online were doing it for attention, for validation, for revenge. I didn't want to be that person. But then my mother showed up at my front door 9 years after she told me I was dead to her. 9 years. And she looked me in the face and said she needed help. And something in me cracked open, not out of bitterness, not out of rage, but because I realized I'd been carrying this story alone for almost a decade, and I was so tired of being quiet about something that almost destroyed me. So this is my story, and I'm going to tell it the way it actually happened. Not the version I told coworkers to keep things light, not the version I told therapists in careful, measured language. The real version, the one that still wakes me up at 2 in the morning sometimes, not from pain anymore, but from this overwhelming gratitude that I got out. If you've ever been told that who you love makes you less worthy of a family's love, this one's for you. Let me take you back to 2014. I was 25 years old, fresh out of undergrad, starting a master's program in communications at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. I was nervous, excited, and completely convinced I was about to be the most underprepared person in every single class I walked into. I grew up in a small town about 40 miles outside of Knoxville. Cedarville. Population maybe 6,000 people. The kind of town where everyone knows your business before you do, where the church parking lot tells you everything about somebody's social status, and where people who leave are either talked about with admiration or suspicion depending on why they left. My family, the Whitfields, were considered respectable. My dad, Robert, worked in insurance. My mom, Diane, had been a stay-at-home mother for most of my childhood, then went back to work as an office manager at a dental practice when my younger sister Kayla and I got older. We had a nice house. We went to church every Sunday. My parents had been married for 30 years. On the surface, we were exactly the kind of family that made other families feel vaguely inferior at potlucks. But here's the thing about surfaces. They're designed to keep what's underneath hidden. My mother, and I say this with the complicated grief of someone who spent years in therapy trying to reconcile it. My mother was a deeply insecure, deeply unhappy woman who expressed that unhappiness through control. She didn't yell. She didn't throw things. She was far more sophisticated than that. She operated through implication, through silence, through the slow withdrawal of warmth that made you feel like you were always one wrong step away from losing her approval entirely. Growing up, I was the good one. I got the grades. I joined the right clubs. I dated the right kind of boys, boys my mother approved of, before I even decided I liked them. I dressed the way she suggested. I spent holidays the way she planned them. I was, in the truest sense of the word, curated, and I mistook that curation for love for a very long time. My sister Kayla was 3 years younger and had figured out our mother much earlier than I had. She'd stopped trying to please Diane by the time she was 16 and spent most of her teenage years either fighting with her or avoiding her. I used to think Kayla was the difficult one. I understand now she was just honest. Anyway, 2014. Graduate school. I walked into my research methods class on the first day and sat down next to a man who was reading a worn copy of James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time and had the kind of quiet confidence that made me instinctively sit up straighter. His name was Marcus Brooks. He was 27, finishing a dual master's in communications and public policy, and he was, I say this as someone who had dated her fair share of mediocre men, the most genuinely interesting person I had ever been in a room with. Not showy interesting, not look at me interesting. The kind of interesting that reveals itself slowly, like you keep pulling at a thread and there's always more there. We started as study partners, then friends, then something that wasn't quite either of those things but didn't have a name yet. He was from Nashville. His mom was a retired high school principal. His dad was a civil engineer. He had two younger sisters he adored. He volunteered on weekends teaching media literacy to middle schoolers in underfunded schools. He made the best jerk chicken I had ever tasted in my life, and he always, always cleaned up after himself, which, after the men I dated in college, felt genuinely revolutionary. By November of that year, we were officially together. And I want to be honest here. I knew. From the very beginning, I knew there was going to be a conversation I would eventually have to have with my family. Because even at 25, even having left Cedarville, I had not fully exited the mental architecture that place had built inside me. I knew my parents' worldview. I knew the quiet, polished, never spoken aloud way that racism operated in my household, not through slurs, not through obvious cruelty, but through assumptions, through the casual, comfortable belief that certain things simply weren't done, through my mother's delicate wrinkling of the nose whenever she'd discuss certain neighborhoods, certain people, certain situations, and the way she'd say, well, you know how they are, with absolute confidence that they needed no explanation. I had pushed against that my whole life without ever directly confronting it, and now it was standing in my living room, metaphorically speaking, wearing a name tag that said Marcus. I told them at Christmas. Not because Christmas was a good time to tell them, it absolutely was not, but because Marcus and I were becoming serious and I refused to spend another holiday pretending a huge part of my life didn't exist. My dad was quiet for a long time after I told them. He looked at the fireplace. He cleared his throat. He said, well, Lauren, that's quite a thing to drop on us on Christmas Eve. My mother said nothing, and the nothing from my mother was so loud it filled the entire room. We got through the rest of Christmas with the kind of brittle politeness that is worse than fighting, because at least fighting is honest. My mother asked me to help with dishes. While we were alone in the kitchen, hands wet with soapy water, she spoke so quietly I had to lean in to hear her. She said, I hope you understand what you're doing to this family. I said, Mom, I'm telling you I'm happy. She said, I hope he's worth it. And the way she said it, not angry, not loud, just deeply, quietly cold. I felt it in the pit of my stomach like a stone dropping into water. Now, if you've been in a situation where you were waiting for a parent to say the wrong thing and dreading it, you already know where this is going. And I want to pause here because I see people in the comments on videos like this sometimes say things like, well, maybe she should have eased them into it more gently, or some people just need time. And I want to address that directly. I gave my family time, 8 months in fact. 8 months of carefully mentioning Marcus in conversation, of sending photos, of talking about him warmly and consistently so that by the time I sat down at that Christmas dinner, his existence was not a surprise. The surprise was that I was asking them to actually meet him. The surprise was that I was taking him seriously enough to bring him home. So no, this was not about needing more time. This was about what they believed. January came. Marcus and I had a long conversation about next steps. He was measured about it in the way that I would come to understand was a kind of emotional self-preservation. He had grown up in America as a black man, and the idea that a white woman's family might not welcome him was not, for him, a shocking novelty. It was a risk he had already calculated. He told me, gently, that he didn't want to be the reason I lost my family. And I told him, even more gently, that I refused to lose myself to keep my family comfortable. We decided he would come to Cedarville in March, meet everyone properly. Easter weekend. I called my mother to arrange it. The conversation lasted 11 minutes, and I kept notes afterward because I had a feeling I was going to need to remember exactly what was said. She asked if I was sure about this. I said yes. She said, you know your grandmother won't understand? I said, Grandma May is 81 and probably won't be there. We're not arranging Easter around her biases? Silence. Then, I just don't want you to regret anything, Lauren. I said, the only thing I'd regret is not being honest with my family. Another silence. Then, very quietly, fine, bring him. Those two words, fine, bring him, were doing so much work. They were doing the work of a woman who had already decided this visit was going to go wrong and was preparing herself to be proven right. Easter weekend, 2015. Marcus drove us down in his car. He was wearing a light blue button-down I had quietly suggested because I knew my mother noticed clothes and I wanted to reduce the number of things she could silently criticize. I felt ashamed of that strategy even as I employed it. Marcus didn't ask why I suggested it. He just said it was a nice shirt. We pulled into my parents' driveway, and I felt the specific cold fear of someone who knows they are about to walk into a situation they cannot control. My dad came out first. He shook Marcus's hand. He was stiff and overly formal, the way people get when they're trying to be polite while privately being uncomfortable, but he shook his hand. He said, "Good to finally put a face to the name." Marcus said something warm and easy about the drive, and my dad half smiled, and I thought, maybe. Maybe this will be okay. My mother was in the kitchen when we came inside. She turned, looked at Marcus, and her face did something I had seen it do my whole life. It smoothed out, arranged itself into perfect hospitality. The kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes but is constructed with such precision that only people who grew up watching it can identify it as fake. She said, "Welcome, Marcus. We've heard so much about you." He said, "Thank you so much for having me, Mrs. Whitfield. It means a lot." She nodded. She turned back to the stove. Kayla, bless her heart, came barreling down the stairs and threw her arms around me and then, without missing a beat, shook Marcus's hand and said, "Okay, so Lauren told me you make incredible jerk chicken, and I need you to know I'm going to hold you to that." And Marcus laughed, really laughed, and the tension in the room dropped about 30%. The meal was tense but survivable. My mother asked Marcus polite, probing questions that sounded like curiosity but were actually an audit. What did his parents do? Where did he grow up? What were his plans after the master's program? She wasn't rude. She wasn't warm. She was professional in the way that a surgeon doing an assessment is professional, efficient, clinical, and ultimately passing judgment. My father talked about football. Marcus talked about football. There were a few genuine moments of conversation there that I allowed myself to hope meant something. After dinner, when Marcus helped clear the table and then insisted on helping with dishes, my mother caught my eye across the kitchen, and I thought I saw something flicker there, something almost like approval, before it closed back down like a shutter. But that night, when Marcus had gone upstairs and I sat in the kitchen with my parents, my dad quietly left the room and my mother sat down across from me and said with that same quiet precision she always used, "He seems like a very nice young man." And I made the mistake of thinking that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. Over the next 18 months, Marcus and I graduated, got jobs, he with a policy nonprofit in Nashville, me with a PR firm that let me work remotely, and moved in together. I told my mother when it happened. She said, "Well, Lauren, I hope you know what you're doing." My dad said, "Just be careful." Neither of them asked for our address. When I called to tell them Marcus had proposed February 2016, he'd taken me to the botanical garden in Nashville. It was cold and absurd and perfect. My mother was so quiet for so long that I thought the call had dropped. Then she said, "Are you pregnant?" I said no. She said, "I see." Two words again, doing enormous heavy lifting. My dad took the phone from her and said, "Congratulations, sweetheart." He sounded sad. Not angry. Just genuinely, deeply sad in a way that broke my heart more than anger would have. And that's when things accelerated. My mother called me back 3 days later. She told me she had spoken with my father, with her sister, my Aunt Carol, and with Pastor Willis, who had apparently been consulted as though this were a congregational matter. She told me that she had done a lot of thinking and praying and that she needed me to understand something. She said, "Lauren, I love you, but I cannot support this marriage." I said, "What does that mean, Mom?" She said, "It means what it means. I can't be there. I can't watch this happen. I know you think I'm being cruel, but I am trying to protect you. I am trying to protect this family." I said, From what? From Marcus? From love? From happiness, she said. From the life you don't understand you're choosing. And then she said it, the sentence that I have turned over in my mind probably 10,000 times since. She said, "If you marry him, Lauren, you are not our daughter anymore. I'm telling you this now so you have time to think. You have a choice to make." I remember standing in the kitchen of our apartment in Nashville and feeling very, very calm. Not the calm of acceptance, the calm of something closing, like a door in my chest swinging shut and latching. I said, "Okay, Mom, I've made my choice. I hope one day you make a different one." And I hung up. I want to talk about what happened in the weeks after that phone call, because I think this part of the story gets skipped in a lot of narratives like mine. People jump from "she said the unforgivable thing" to "I was strong and moved on." And I want to be really honest with you, I was not strong. I was devastated. I cried in the shower for 3 days. I cried in the car on the way to work, very carefully, so that I wouldn't walk in with puffy eyes. I sat with Marcus on our couch and cried in a way I hadn't since I was a little girl. That ugly, gasping, snotty kind of crying where your whole face hurts after. And he held me and didn't say anything that was supposed to fix it. He just held me. He told me once, during that time, that he was sorry. That he was sorry I was going through this because of him. And I made him look at me and I said, "Do not do that. Do not take on their racism as your fault. I need you to promise me right now you'll never carry that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Okay, I promise." My sister Kayla called me the day after I hung up on my mother. She'd heard everything secondhand and she was furious, not at me, at our parents. She said, "This is insane. This is absolutely insane. And I want you to know I think you're doing the right thing, and I'll be at your wedding." She kept that promise. My dad sent a single text message 3 weeks before the wedding. It said, "I love you, Lauren. I'm sorry." Nothing else. He didn't come. I've never fully forgiven him for that, though I understand it better than I used to. My mother had given him a choice too. We got married on October 15th, 2016, in Nashville, at a small venue with string lights and good food and a live jazz band that Marcus's uncle played in. 63 guests, Marcus's entire family, my sister Kayla as my maid of honor, two of my closest friends from grad school, my college roommate who had driven up from Atlanta. It was the most beautiful day of my life. And, yes, there was grief there too. You don't walk down an aisle without your parents, without feeling it. Kayla walked me down the aisle. She cried the whole way. I made it approximately to the third row of chairs before I started crying too, and Marcus saw my face and his eyes went bright and a little wet, and somehow that was the thing that made me feel like everything was going to be okay. Kayla gave a toast that made everyone laugh and then cry and then laugh again. Marcus's mother pulled me into a hug during cocktail hour that lasted a long time, and she whispered, "You are exactly who I hoped he'd find." And I had to excuse myself to the bathroom for 5 minutes. Nobody from my immediate family, except Kayla, was there. Not my parents, not my aunts, not cousins I'd grown up with. Nothing. I had to feel all of that and still be a bride. It's a strange thing to hold two enormous emotional truths at the same time, the joy of one of the best days of your life, and the grief of the people who chose not to be part of it. If you've ever had to do that, hold joy and grief in both hands at the same time, you already know there's no words for it. You just get through it. The years after the wedding were quiet, in terms of my family. My mother did not call. My father called twice, once on my birthday in 2017, a stilted 5-minute conversation where we talked about the weather, and he asked how I was doing, and I said, "Fine," and we both pretended that was a real answer. Once in 2018, when Marcus and I had just found out we were expecting Elijah, I told my dad. He was quiet for a moment and said, "That's wonderful news, Lauren. You'll be a good mother." And then he said, "Your mom doesn't know I'm calling." And I said I knew. I followed my parents on Facebook. I hadn't been blocked. I think my mother forgot or didn't know how. And occasionally I'd see photos. Their anniversary dinner, my mother's garden, Christmas gatherings where cousins I hadn't spoken to in years were smiling in my childhood living room like I had never existed. I'd put the phone down and go do something physical. Walk around the block, do the dishes, hold Elijah when he was a baby and breathe him in. I built a life, a real, beautiful, complicated, joy-filled life. Marcus got promoted. We bought a house in Austin in 2019, a cream-colored house with a big porch and a yard where Biscuit would eventually destroy every plant I tried to grow. I took on more clients with my PR work and eventually went fully independent. Elisha started kindergarten. Maya was born in 2020, right in the middle of everything that was happening in the world, which meant the first year of her life we were completely cocooned, just us, which was actually this strange gift. Marcus's family became my family in the fullest sense of the word. His mother, Gloria, called me every Sunday without fail. His sisters, Priya and Jade, were my actual best friends. We did holidays together, Thanksgiving at Gloria's, Christmas alternating between her place and ours, Easter egg hunts in our backyard that devolved into chaos because Elijah took competition extremely seriously, and Maya just ate the chocolate, regardless of whether she found it in a hidden location. And Kayla. Kayla came to Austin twice a year minimum. She was Auntie Kay to our kids in a way that made my heart full every single time I watched her chase Elijah around the yard or read to Maya in her ridiculous character voices. My mother was a ghost, a presence I'd arranged myself not to need. And then, in the fall of 2023, my sister called me on a Tuesday afternoon. Kayla never called on Tuesdays. She texted constantly, long rambling strings of texts about her day, about reality television, about whatever chaos was happening in Cedarville, which apparently never ran out, but she didn't call on Tuesdays. I knew something was wrong before I picked up. She said, "Lauren, okay, I need to tell you something and I need you to not spiral." I said, "You're already making me spiral by saying that." She said, "Dad had a stroke last spring." I'm going to pause here and let that land. My father had a stroke. In the spring. 6 months before Kayla was telling me about it. 6 months. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold in my hand while Kayla talked, and I felt something happen to my face. Not crying, not anger, but this white, blank, empty feeling of having been kept from something I had a right to know. She said my mother had told no one outside immediate family and had specifically told Kayla not to call me. My dad had had a moderate stroke, right side, some weakness, some speech difficulties, significant improvement with therapy but lasting effects. He was mobile. He was home. He was diminished in ways that Kayla described carefully and I could hear were worse than her careful description. I said, "Why are you telling me now?" She said, "Because Mom is out of money." And then the picture started to assemble itself. Here's what had happened, piece by piece, as Kayla told it. My father's insurance had been adequate but not generous. The stroke recovery, the therapy, the specialist appointments, the medications, the modifications to the house had cost far more than they'd anticipated. My father, it turned out, had been less financially stable than anyone knew. The insurance business he'd worked in for 30 years had been shrinking for over a decade, and he'd been dipping into savings to maintain appearances for years. My mother had, at some point in the last 3 years, sold the Cedarville house and moved them into a smaller rental. She'd been working more hours at the dental practice. But the rental had gone up. The medical bills were ongoing. And my father was not, at this point, able to work at all. They were in serious financial trouble. I said, "What does this have to do with me?" And Kayla said very quietly, "Mom wants to come see you." I want to stop here for a second, because I know what a lot of you are thinking. You're thinking, don't open that door. You're thinking, after everything she said to you? After 9 years of silence? After missing your wedding, missing your children being born, missing the entire scaffolding of your adult life, now she gets to knock? I thought all of those things. But I also thought about my dad, who had sent me that text message years ago. I love you, Lauren. I'm sorry. Who had called on my birthday and pretended the weather was a sufficient topic of conversation because he couldn't navigate the larger truth. Who was now sitting somewhere with the aftermath of a stroke and a wife who controlled every narrative and a daughter he hadn't seen in 7 years. I called Marcus that night after the kids were in bed and I told him everything. And he did what he always does. He sat with it. He didn't jump to a position. He just sat with me in the uncertainty of it. He said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I don't know yet, but I think I need to let her come." He looked at me for a long moment and then said, "Okay, then we'll let her come. But Lauren, we set the terms. She comes to our house, to our life, on our terms. She meets our kids on our terms. And if she says one word that I think is going to hurt you or them, I know I said, I mean it. I know I said again. So do I." My mother arrived on a Thursday in November. I had spent 2 weeks preparing for this visit in a way that I am slightly embarrassed to admit. I cleaned the house obsessively. I thought about where to put things, what to cook, what the kids were going to be wearing when she arrived. Marcus watched me do all of this and said, at one point, "Lauren, you don't need to perform for her." He was right. I knew he was right. I still cleaned the kitchen twice. She arrived in a rental car. She was thinner than I remembered. Her hair, which had always been meticulously done, was shorter and had more gray in it. She was wearing clothes that were nice but worn, the kind of nice that is holding on past its expiration date. She stood at the end of my porch walkway and looked at the house for a moment, and then she looked at me. I hadn't seen my mother in 9 years. 9 years. She looked older. She looked smaller. She looked like a woman who had been frightened for a long time and was trying not to show it. She said, "Lauren." I said, "Mom." There was a moment, not a hug. I wasn't ready for a hug, and I don't think she was sure one was available to her. We stood there for a beat, and then I said, "Come inside," and she followed me. Marcus was in the living room with Elijah and Maya. When my mother walked in, Marcus stood and said, "Diane, good to see you." His voice was level, not warm, not cold, perfectly masterfully level. She said, "Marcus." She looked at him the way people look at someone they've tried to imagine for years and are now confronting with the reality of in person. Not hatred. Something more complicated than that. Reckoning, maybe. And then Elijah said, "Are you Grandma Diane?" Mom showed us pictures, and my mother's face did something I had never seen it do. It crumpled. Just for a second. And then she pulled herself together and said, "Yes, I am." And she sounded like someone speaking through a much smaller throat than usual. Maya, who has approximately zero social filters because she's 5, walked right up to my mother and said, "You have pretty earrings." And my mother laughed a real laugh, startled out of her, and said, "Thank you, sweetheart." I watched Marcus watching all of this, and his jaw was tight, but his face was carefully open. I loved him completely in that moment. The kids went to bed at 7:30. Marcus and I had agreed beforehand that we would talk to my mother together. No private conversations. No catching me alone in the kitchen. Together. We sat at the dining room table with tea. My mother wrapped her hands around the mug, and for a long moment nobody said anything. Then she said, "I need help." She said it simply, stripped of anything performative. Just the words. I said, "I know." Kayla told me about Dad. She nodded. She told me in more detail than Kayla had about the financial situation, about the medical bills, about the savings being gone, about the house being sold, about working as much as she could. But the dental practice had cut hours, and her knees were starting to give her trouble, and Dad needed care during the day that she couldn't always be there to provide, and the aid they'd been using had become unaffordable. And then she looked at me and said, "I need to ask you for a loan. Significant enough to cover the next 6 months of your father's care and our basic expenses while I figure out the longer-term situation." The number she named was $42,000. And here's the thing. And I need you to hear this clearly because this is the part that tells you everything about who my mother still was underneath the grief and the fear. She said it as though she expected it, not as a plea, not as a question, as a statement of what was required, as though the primary question was the logistics of transfer, not whether I would agree. Marcus set his mug down very carefully on the table. I looked at my mother and I said, "Mom, before we talk about any money, and I'm not saying yes or no yet, I need to talk about something else first." She looked at me, waiting. I said, "You told me I wasn't your daughter anymore. You said that. Those were your exact words. And then you didn't come to my wedding. And you didn't call when Elijah was born. And you didn't call when Maya was born. You didn't call when we bought our house. You didn't call on my birthday for 6 years. And you didn't tell me when Dad had a stroke." She opened her mouth. I said, "I'm not finished." She closed it. I said, "I am willing to have a relationship with you. I have never stopped wanting a mother. But I need you to understand something very clearly. This is my husband, this is my house, these are my children. This is my life, and it is a good life, and I am happy in it. If you want to be part of it, truly part of it, then I need to hear you say that you understand what you did and what it cost me. Not what you were going through, what it cost me. And I need to hear you say that Marcus is my husband, and you respect that. Genuinely, not as a courtesy, not as a transaction." The silence that followed was very long. My mother looked at the table. She looked at her hands. She looked up at Marcus and then at me, and she looked like someone doing painful internal arithmetic. And then she said very quietly, "I was wrong. About Marcus. About what I said to you. I was wrong and I was frightened and I was raised to believe things that I understand now were wrong. And I am sorry, Lauren. I am genuinely sorry." She turned and looked directly at Marcus. "I am sorry to you as well. For what I assumed, for what I cost your wife, for not being willing to know you." Marcus held her gaze for a long moment. He said, "Thank you for saying that." He didn't say he forgave her. He didn't say it was okay. He said, "Thank you for saying that." And I knew him well enough to understand exactly what that meant. It was acknowledgement, not absolution. It was the minimum required, accepted. I reached across the table and put my hand over my mother's hands, and I felt her go very still. I said, "I'm not giving you $42,000. She looked up quickly. I said, "But I am going to help you. We're going to figure out what Dad actually needs medically, and Marcus and I will cover those specific costs directly, paid to providers, not as a general fund. And I'm going to find you a financial counselor because that situation is fixable with the right help. And I want you to come for Christmas this year." She blinked. I think she had prepared herself for a harder fight. I said, "But Mom, I need you to understand this is a relationship now, not a transaction. If you want in, you're all the way in. The kids, Marcus, the life, you don't get to pick and choose." She nodded slowly. "You don't get to pick and choose." She nodded, slowly, like someone accepting terms they'd negotiated down from something worse. Then she said, "Are they your children? What are their names?" And something about the asking, the simple, genuine, finally asking of it, broke something open in the room. I said, "Elijah and Maya." She said, "Those are beautiful names." And that was somehow the beginning. I won't tell you my mother became a different person overnight. She didn't. The first Christmas she visited, she said something at dinner that made Marcus's jaw tick, and I had to give her a look that conveyed a great deal in very few facial muscles, and she course corrected. There were moments, moments of the old Diane peeking through, the old careful categories, the old hierarchies she'd been taught were fixed. And every time, Marcus and I dealt with it. Together. She went home and she called her pastor, not Pastor Willis, who had retired, but a younger pastor in the new church she joined, and apparently had some long conversations about the beliefs she'd been carrying. I don't know exactly what was said in those conversations. I know that things began to shift. She called me on a Sunday in February, just to talk, not to ask for anything. just to hear about the kids. And then she called again the next Sunday, and the one after that. My father. I should tell you about my father. We went to Knoxville that spring, Marcus and I, and the kids, to see him. The stroke had left him with some lingering weakness in his right hand and a slight slowing of his speech that was very different from the careful, measured way he'd always talk. He looked at Marcus when we came in the door, and reached out with his left hand, his stronger one, and shook his hand and said, with great effort and great intention, "I'm glad you came." Marcus said, "I'm glad we did too, sir." My father pulled me into a hug with his left arm and held on longer than he usually would have. He had always been a brief hug person. That afternoon he held on. Elijah, because he is himself in the most complete sense of the word, immediately asked my dad if he wanted to see his Minecraft world. And my dad said sure, not knowing what that was, and an hour later they were sitting side by side on the couch with a tablet while my dad listened to Elijah explain his entire architectural process with the patience of a man who had been given a second chance at something and knew it. My dad died 14 months later, a second stroke more severe. He passed in his sleep, which the doctors told us was peaceful, which I believe because I have to. I was with my mother when it happened. I had driven to Knoxville when things became critical, and Marcus stayed in Austin with the kids, and I sat with my mother in a hospital waiting room at 3 in the morning while a doctor told us very gently that Dad had not made it. My mother reached for my hand, and I held it. Grief does strange things to estrangements. It tears down walls, not because the reasons for the walls were wrong, but because the weight of loss makes construction seem less important than shelter. My mother is not perfect. She will, I think, never be the mother I needed when I was 25. The things she did, the ultimatum, the silence, the years of absence, those things happened and they have consequences that live in me in ways I'm still understanding. I see my therapist every other week, and a lot of our sessions are still in some form about my mother. But she comes to Austin 4 times a year now. She calls on Sundays. She has learned, slowly and imperfectly, that Marcus is not a category but a person, and that the person is remarkable, and that the grandchildren she almost chose not to know are the most wonderful humans she has ever encountered. Elijah calls her Grandma Dee. Maya calls her Grandma Diane, with full formality because Maya finds formality hilarious for reasons none of us fully understand. She is learning. Late. Painfully late. But learning. I get asked sometimes, by friends, by people who hear fragments of this story, whether I think I did the right thing. Letting her back in. Helping with the finances, even in the more limited way I did. Whether I should have held firmer, held longer, held the door completely shut. And here's what I've landed on, after a lot of therapy and a lot of long conversations with Marcus and a lot of nights thinking about it while Biscuit snored at the foot of our bed. I didn't let her back in for her sake. Not primarily. I let her back in because I have 2 children who deserve to know that love is possible across all kinds of distance. Because I wanted Elijah and Maya to grow up in a family that had done the hard work of repair. Not the fake repair, the let's pretend nothing happened repair, but the real kind, where you actually say the hard things and sit in the discomfort and do it anyway. I let her back in because my father asked me to forgive him in the only way he knew how, a text message and 2 phone calls, and I didn't want to spend the rest of my life carrying the grief of not having responded to that. I let her back in because I am not actually interested in being the person who says, "You had your chance and now it's gone forever." That's not my kind of strength. My kind of strength is Marcus looking my mother in the eye at our dining room table and accepting her apology without flinching and then choosing, every single day, to show up anyway. My kind of strength is Kayla, who kept the thread between us when everything else snapped. My kind of strength is the 2 kids asleep down the hall who don't know any of this history yet, but who will, someday, and I want them to see that their parents chose love with their eyes wide open. I let her back in because the alternative was closing a door that I'd be standing at for the rest of my life wondering about. And I don't want to wonder. I want to know. I'm not going to tell you that you should do what I did. If your situation is different, if your family is dangerous, if returning would cost you your safety or your sense of self, if the door needs to stay closed for you to stay whole, then close it and don't look back. There is no moral obligation to set yourself on fire to keep people warm who chose to walk out into the cold. But if you're in the in-between, if you're someone whose family has done something irreparable and is now standing at a door they shut, and you're trying to figure out what the right thing is, then I just want to say there is no formula. There is only your truth, your capacity, and your own clear-eyed accounting of what you can afford to give and what you cannot. And whatever you decide is enough. You are enough. You were always enough. The last thing I'll tell you is this. This past April, Elijah turned 8. We had a birthday party in the backyard. Chaotic, loud, 17 8-year-olds running around with water guns, which Marcus had volunteered to oversee and immediately regretted. My mother was there. Marcus's mom Gloria was there. Kayla was there. Maya stood on the porch in the specific regal way she stands on porches and announced periodically that she should also have cake even though it wasn't her birthday. At some point in the afternoon, I went inside to get more ice, and when I came back out, I stood at the kitchen door for a moment and just looked at it. My mother and Gloria were sitting in lawn chairs in the corner of the yard. My mother was saying something. Gloria was laughing. Not politely laughing, actually laughing. The big, warm, whole-body laugh that Marcus has inherited. Marcus was on his hands and knees being used as a horse by two of Elijah's friends who had clearly identified him as the most willing adult. Elijah was opening presents with the focus of a scientist and the enthusiasm of someone who has never been disappointed by a gift in his life. Kayla was refilling the chip bowl. Maya was eating cake that she had absolutely gotten for herself without asking anyone. I stood there and I felt something I didn't have a word for in the moment. I have thought about it since. I think the word is arrival. Like this is the place, not a perfect place, not an uncomplicated place, but the place I was always trying to get to, through all of it, the ultimatum, the silence, the grief, the years of building something new in the rubble of something broken. This, right here. I wanted to tell you that, because maybe you're in the middle of it right now, in the part where it just hurts and the payoff feels impossible. And I wanted you to know there is an arrival waiting for you. It might not look like mine, but it's there. Thank you for listening to my story. I know it was a long one. If any of it resonated with you, if you've been through something like this, if you're in it right now, or if you've come out the other side, I really want to hear from you. Drop it in the comments. Tell me where you are. I read every single one. And if this is your first time here, welcome. Hit subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this one. New one drops every week. Take care of yourselves. And take care of each other. I'll see you next time.